I never thought my neighborly gesture of helping out during a power outage would turn into the most exhausting battle of my life. But here I was, standing in my driveway holding a ridiculous fine from the HOA for storing propane tanks on my property. My name is Xavier Johnson, and I bought my house in Pine Ridge, Colorado 3 years ago. It's a beautiful neighborhood nestled in the foothills, with spectacular views of the Rockies and what I thought were reasonable people. The development was built about 15 years ago, and like most planned communities, it came with a homeowners association. I'd had minimal interaction with them until last winter, when everything changed. It started innocently enough. Colorado winters can be brutal, and our neighborhood had experienced a few power outages over the years. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, so I tend to think ahead about these things. I installed a propane-powered backup generator at my house, along with a propane fireplace insert and a propane water heater. To keep everything running smoothly, I maintained a supply of propane tanks on the side of my house, properly stored and secured according to all relevant safety codes. The tanks were neatly arranged on a concrete pad I'd poured myself, behind a privacy fence that matched the neighborhood aesthetic perfectly. I had 1,200-gallon tanks in total, which might sound like a lot, but given Colorado's harsh winters and the unreliability of our local power grid, it was a sensible precaution. Everything was legal, inspected, and approved by the county. Last February, we had a massive ice storm that knocked out power across 3 counties. My neighborhood was without electricity for nearly a week. The temperatures dropped to -15 degrees at night, and people were desperate. I opened my home to several neighbors, including the elderly couple next door, the family with a newborn across the street, and a few others. My propane setup kept us all warm, allowed us to cook hot meals, and even powered enough lights to keep everyone's spirits up. When the power came back on, I received nothing but gratitude. Casseroles appeared on my doorstep, thank you cards filled my mailbox, and I even got a bottle of expensive whiskey from Tom, the guy across the street whose wife had just given birth. I felt good about being able to help my community. I thought that was the end of it. Then, 3 weeks ago, I found the letter in my mailbox. It was from the Pine Ridge HOA, and the return address alone made my stomach sink. I'd heard stories about HOA overreach, but I'd been fortunate enough to avoid any issues until now. The letter was printed on official letterhead, signed by one Helen Norton, the HOA president. The letter stated that my propane tank storage violated the community's aesthetic guidelines and posed a safety hazard. I was being fined $200 per tank per month, retroactive to when I'd installed them 2 years ago. The math made my head spin. They were claiming I owed nearly $50,000 in fines. I read the letter 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. But no, it was clear. Helen Norton had decided that my propane tanks were unacceptable, despite the fact that they were completely hidden from view, met all safety requirements, and had literally saved people during the winter storm. The next day, I requested a meeting with the HOA board. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, a bland building near the neighborhood entrance that hosted everything from yoga classes to blood drives. I arrived 15 minutes early, armed with documentation. I had copies of the county permits, safety inspection reports, photographs showing how well concealed the tanks were, and even some of the thank you notes from neighbors I'd helped during the outage. I felt prepared and confident that once I explained the situation, we could resolve this misunderstanding. The community center meeting room was depressing, with fluorescent lights that hummed constantly and cheap folding chairs arranged in rows. The HOA board sat at a folding table at the front, Helen Norton in the center, flanked by two other board members whose names I didn't know. Helen was exactly what I expected. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with a severe blonde bob that looked like it required a team of professionals to maintain. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her expression suggested she'd been sucking on lemons all day. "Mr. Johnson," she said as I approached, not bothering to stand or offer her hand. "Please have a seat." I sat in the front row, placing my folder of documents on the empty chair beside me. Two other homeowners were scattered in the back rows, probably there for other business. "I'm here about the fine I received," I started. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Helen held up one perfectly manicured hand. "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Johnson. You're in violation of Community Standards Section 14, subsection C, which clearly states that no industrial equipment or bulk storage containers may be visible from any street or common area." "But they're not visible," I countered. "They're behind a 6-foot privacy fence on the side of my house. You can't see them from anywhere unless you're standing in my yard. One of our board members took the liberty of inspecting from your driveway," Helen said, shuffling papers in front of her. "The tops of the tanks are visible from certain angles. From certain angles. You'd have to stand at the very edge of my property line and crane your neck to see them. That's hardly a violation of aesthetic standards." Helen's expression hardened. "The rules are the rules, Mr. Johnson. The covenant is designed to maintain property values and community standards. These tanks provided heat and safety for multiple families during the ice storm," I said, pulling out my documents, "including the Hendersons, who are in their 80s, and the Martins, who had a week-old baby. Without that propane, people could have been seriously hurt or worse." One of the other board members, a man in his 60s with a receding hairline, leaned forward. "That was very generous of you, Mr. Johnson, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated the covenant you agreed to when you purchased your home." "I've reviewed the covenant extensively," I said, opening my folder. "Section 14. Subsection C refers to commercial vehicles and industrial manufacturing equipment. Propane storage for residential backup systems isn't mentioned anywhere." Helen sighed dramatically. "The interpretation of the covenant falls to the board. We've determined that your setup violates the spirit of the rules." "The spirit of the rules? You're trying to fine me $50,000 based on your interpretation of the spirit of the rules." "The fine structure is clearly outlined in our penalty guidelines," Helen said. "And if you don't comply within 30 days, additional fees will accrue." I felt my blood pressure rising. This is insane. Everything I've done is legal, properly permitted, and has been a benefit to this community. "Whether it's legal or not isn't our concern," Helen said dismissively. "We're concerned with maintaining the standards of Pine Ridge. Now, if there's nothing else, we have other business to attend to." I stood up, gathering my papers. "You'll be hearing from my attorney." Helen's thin smile didn't reach her eyes. "We expected nothing less, Mr. Johnson. Good evening." I left the community center furious and bewildered. In my car, I sat for a few minutes trying to calm down before driving. This couldn't be real. They couldn't actually enforce such an absurd fine for something that wasn't even a legitimate violation. The next morning, I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who'd handled my home purchase. After I explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "They're claiming $50,000, Marcus finally said. "Based on $200 per tank per month, retroactive for 2 years. Xavier, I need to review your HOA covenant and their bylaws. Can you send me everything you have?" I spent the next hour scanning and emailing documents to Marcus. He called me back that afternoon, and the news wasn't what I wanted to hear. "The language in Section 14 is ambiguous," Marcus said. "It could be interpreted to include propane storage, though I think that's a stretch. The bigger problem is that the covenant gives the board broad authority to interpret and enforce rules as they see fit. So they can just make up whatever they want. Not exactly, but they have significant latitude. The good news is that the retroactive fine is almost certainly unenforceable. They can't penalize you for something they only recently decided was a violation. The bad news is that going forward, they probably can require you to remove the tanks or relocate them to comply with their interpretation. This is ridiculous. I agree, but HOA disputes are tricky. I can send them a letter challenging the fine and their interpretation, but if they don't back down, you're looking at litigation. That could cost tens of thousands in legal fees, and there's no guarantee we'd win." I thanked Marcus and hung up, feeling defeated. The idea of spending years in court fighting over propane tanks seemed insane, but so did paying $50,000 or removing my backup system. For the next week, I tried to focus on work and normal life, but the HOA situation gnawed at me. Marcus sent his letter to the board, and we received a response within days. Helen Norton, on behalf of the board, rejected our position entirely. They reduced the retroactive portion to 1 year instead of 2, cutting the fine to $25,000, as if that was some kind of generous compromise. Going forward, I had 30 days to remove the tanks or face continued penalties. I was discussing options with Marcus when I stumbled upon something interesting. I was reviewing the HOA covenant in detail, making notes about any possible defenses, when I noticed something in Section 22. It dealt with utility services and backup systems. Buried in the middle of a dense paragraph about generators and backup power was a sentence that made me stop cold. "The community center shall maintain adequate backup heating and power systems to serve as an emergency shelter during extended power outages or natural disasters." I pulled up the community center specifications and started digging through county records. The community center had been built at the same time as the rest of the neighborhood. According to the plans, it had a propane-based backup heating system designed to keep the building habitable during emergencies. I drove to the community center the next morning. It was a weekday, and the place was mostly empty except for a fitness class in one of the side rooms. I walked around the building trying to look casual while I examined the exterior. Sure enough, on the north side of the building, hidden behind some landscaping, I found them. 5 large propane tanks, each bigger than mine, sitting on a concrete pad. They were partially screened by shrubs, but they were clearly visible from the parking lot. I took several photographs from different angles, making sure to capture the tanks and their surroundings clearly. My heart was racing. This was exactly the same setup the HOA was trying to find me for, but on a larger scale and arguably more visible from common areas. I called Marcus immediately. "I found something. The HOA has their own propane tanks at the community center, and they're more visible than mine." "That's interesting," Marcus said. "That could show selective enforcement, which would strengthen your case. But Xavier, I have to be honest with you. Even with this, fighting an HOA in court is expensive and unpredictable." "I understand, but I'm not paying them $25,000 for following the same safety practices they use themselves. Then we keep fighting. I'll amend our response to include this information." The HOA's next letter arrived a week later, and it was even more aggressive. Helen had doubled down, stating that the community center's propane system was grandfathered in and not subject to current aesthetic standards. My tanks, being newer, fell under revised guidelines. It was bureaucratic nonsense, but it showed they weren't going to back down. I was venting about the situation to my neighbor Tom one evening when he mentioned something that changed everything. "You know, it's weird you bring this up," Tom said. We were standing in his driveway while his kids played in the front yard. My brother-in-law works for the county's planning department. He mentioned something a few months ago about Pine Ridge HOA having permit issues. What kind of issues? I don't know the details, but apparently they did some work on the community center without proper permits. There was some kind of dispute about it. The next day, I went to the county planning office in Castle Rock. After waiting in line for 20 minutes, I spoke with a clerk and requested all permits and inspection records for the Pine Ridge Community Center. The records told an interesting story. The original propane system for the community center had been installed when the building was constructed, but 3 years ago, the HOA had expanded the system, adding 3 additional tanks. According to the permits, the work had been done by a company called Front Range Propane Services. Here's where it got interesting. The installation permit had been applied for, but the final inspection had never been completed. According to the notes in the file, the inspector had found several code violations during the rough inspection and had required corrections before final approval. But there was no record of those corrections being made or a final inspection being scheduled. I made copies of everything and took them to Marcus. "This is significant," Marcus said, reviewing the documents. "If their propane system isn't properly permitted and inspected, they're in violation of county code. That could be a safety issue. Can we use this? Absolutely. At minimum, it shows incredible hypocrisy. They're fining you for a properly permitted system while operating an unpermitted one themselves. But Xavier, this could actually be more serious than a civil dispute. If they're operating a propane system that failed inspection in a public building, that's a potential safety violation. What do you suggest? Let me reach out to the county code enforcement office. If there's a legitimate safety issue, they need to know about it." Marcus contacted the county, and within a week, an inspector was sent to the community center. I wasn't privy to the details of the inspection, but the results became clear when I received an angry call from Helen Norton. "Mr. Johnson, I know you're behind this harassment from the county," Helen said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I simply provided public records to the appropriate authorities," I said calmly. "You've forced us to shut down the community center's backup heating system. Do you understand what that means? If we have another power outage, we won't have an emergency shelter. Maybe you should have made sure your system was properly permitted and inspected," I replied. "I assume this means you'll be withdrawing the fines against me." "Absolutely not. Your violation is separate from any issues with the community center. So you're going to continue fining me for having a permitted, inspected propane system while you operate an unpermitted one. We will have our permits in order shortly," Helen said, "and your fines will continue to accrue until you comply." She hung up before I could respond. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated. I received 2 more letters from the HOA, each threatening legal action if I didn't remove my tanks. Marcus sent responses on my behalf, but we seemed to be at an impasse. The HOA had shut down their community center's propane system and were apparently in the process of getting the proper permits and corrections done, but they refused to back down on my situation. Then, I had an idea. It was petty, possibly childish, but I'd reached the point where I didn't care anymore. According to the HOA's own bylaws, the covenant I'd agreed to when I purchased my home stated that I could remove any improvements or systems from my property at any time, provided removal didn't damage the property or violate building codes. The propane tanks weren't permanently installed. They were simply sitting on a concrete pad, connected with flexible lines that could be easily disconnected. I called Front Range Propane Services, the same company that had installed the community center system. I explained that I wanted to remove my propane tanks and convert my backup systems to run on natural gas instead. "That's a pretty big job," the technician said. "Natural gas generators are expensive, and you'll need to run gas lines for the fireplace and water heater. How much are we talking?" "Probably $30,000 for everything, maybe more. And that's assuming your natural gas service can handle the load." That was more than I wanted to spend, but I'd reached the point where this was about principle. "Let me think about it and get back to you." That evening, I sat on my back deck with a beer, watching the sunset over the mountains. The whole situation was insane. I was contemplating spending $30,000 to spite an HOA board, which was exactly the kind of thing I'd always mocked other people for doing. Then I remembered something. During the ice storm, when I'd opened my home to neighbors, I'd heard Helen Norton on her phone one evening. She'd come by ostensibly to check on everyone, though I suspected she was really there to enjoy the warmth. I'd overheard her telling someone that the community center's backup heat wasn't working, which was why people were having to shelter in individual homes instead. At the time, I hadn't thought much about it. Systems fail sometimes, especially in extreme cold. But now, knowing that their propane system had never been properly completed or inspected, I wondered if it had ever worked at all. I pulled out my phone and started searching through the HOA's minutes and communications from the past few years. As a homeowner, I had access to these records through the community website. It took me an hour of reading through boring committee reports and budget discussions, but I finally found what I was looking for. 2 years ago, there had been a discussion about the community center's backup systems. A homeowner had asked about emergency shelter protocols during severe weather. Helen had responded that the community center was fully equipped to serve as a shelter with backup heat and power. She'd specifically mentioned the propane system and assured residents that it was maintained and ready for use. But according to the county records, the system had failed its rough inspection 3 years ago and had never been approved. If it had failed the rough inspection, it almost certainly hadn't been functioning properly for at least that long. This meant Helen had been telling residents for years that they had an emergency shelter available when, in reality, the system didn't work. During the ice storm, that false sense of security could have put people in danger. I called Marcus first thing the next morning. "I think Helen Norton and the HOA board might have committed fraud." I explained what I'd found, walking him through the timeline. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a serious allegation, Xavier. Fraud requires proving intentional deception." She told residents the emergency shelter was functional when she knew, or should have known, that it wasn't. People made decisions about their safety based on that information. "You might have a point. Let me research this." If residents relied on her statements about the emergency shelter and could have been harmed because of it, that could be negligent misrepresentation at minimum. While Marcus looked into the legal angles, I did some more digging. I reached out to other neighbors who'd been affected by the ice storm, asking about their experiences. What I found was disturbing. The elderly Hendersons next door had tried to go to the community center when the power first went out. They'd driven over in dangerous conditions because Helen had assured everyone in a neighborhood-wide email that the shelter was open and heated. When they arrived, the building was freezing. A sign on the door said the backup heat was temporarily out of service. Mrs. Henderson, who was 78 and had respiratory issues, had nearly developed hypothermia before they made it back home and over to my house. If I hadn't been there with my propane system, she could have died. The Martins, with their newborn baby, had a similar story. They tried the community center first before coming to my house. The baby had been exposed to dangerous cold for over an hour. I documented everything, getting written statements from the Hendersons and the Martins. Marcus reviewed them and called me back the next day. "Xavier, this is bigger than an HOA dispute now. What Helen Norton did could constitute reckless endangerment. She knowingly told residents that a safety resource was available when it wasn't during a weather emergency. People could have died. What should we do?" "I think we need to report this to the district attorney's office. This isn't a civil matter anymore. And Xavier, there's something else. If we go this route, it's going to make your HOA fight look like a picnic. You'll be making serious enemies in your neighborhood." "I understand. But people could have died because she lied about the emergency shelter. That's not something I can just ignore." Marcus prepared a detailed report and submitted it to the Douglas County District Attorney's office. We included all the county records showing the failed inspection, the HOA minutes where Helen claimed the system was functional, the email she'd sent during the ice storm directing people to the non-functional shelter, and statements from the Hendersons and Martins about what happened. For 3 weeks, I heard nothing. The HOA sent me another letter threatening to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the fines. Marcus filed a response in county court, formally challenging the fines and requesting an injunction. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, I looked out my window and saw 2 Douglas County Sheriff's vehicles parked in front of the community center. I drove over and parked at a distance, watching as deputies escorted Helen Norton and another board member, a man I didn't recognize, out of the building. They weren't in handcuffs, but it was clear this was more than a friendly conversation. The deputies spent another hour inside the community center, apparently collecting records. That evening, Tom came over to my house, his eyes wide. "Dude, did you see what happened at the community center? The cops were there all morning." "I saw some of it. Word is that Helen and some other board members are being investigated for something serious. Nobody knows exactly what, but there are rumors about fraud and endangering people during the ice storm." I kept my expression neutral. "Really? That's crazy. You had propane during the storm, right?" "The cops came by earlier asking if anyone had information about who'd provided shelter during the outage. I told them about you and your setup." "Thanks, Tom." 2 days later, a detective from the sheriff's office called me. Detective Sarah Morrison asked if I could come in to provide a statement about the ice storm and my interactions with the HOA board. I met Detective Morrison at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office in Castle Rock. She was in her early 40s, with short brown hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. We sat in a plain interview room, and she recorded our conversation. "Mr. Johnson, I want to thank you for coming in," she started. "We're investigating allegations of reckless endangerment and fraud related to the Pine Ridge HOA's actions during the February ice storm. Can you walk me through what happened?" I told her everything, from installing my propane system to helping neighbors during the storm to discovering that the community center's backup heat wasn't working despite Helen's assurances. I provided copies of all my documentation, including the county records and neighbor statements. Detective Morrison took extensive notes. "And you're saying Mrs. Norton knew the community center's heating system wasn't functional when she directed residents to shelter there? She had to know." The system failed inspection 3 years ago and was never corrected. As HOA president, she would have known about that. Yet she still told people it was a safe shelter during the storm. Can you think of any reason why she would do that? I considered this. Honestly, I think she didn't want to admit there was a problem. The HOA had spent money on the system, and acknowledging it didn't work would have made her look bad, so she just kept pretending everything was fine. The detective nodded. And then, when you reported the permit issues to the county, she retaliated by fining you for your propane system. That's how it feels, yes. My system is properly permitted and legal, but she's trying to force me to remove it and pay ridiculous fines. The interview lasted about an hour. When it was over, Detective Morrison thanked me and said they'd be in touch if they needed anything else. The next week was tense. I saw sheriff's vehicles in the neighborhood several times, apparently interviewing other residents. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with speculation and rumors. Some people defended Helen, saying she'd always worked hard for the community. Others, particularly those who'd been affected by the failed emergency shelter, were angry and demanding answers. Then, on a Friday afternoon, news broke. The Douglas County District Attorney's Office announced that Helen Norton had been charged with 2 counts of reckless endangerment and 1 count of fraud. The other board member, who'd been present during some of the key decisions, was charged with reckless endangerment. According to the press release, Helen had knowingly directed residents to a non-functional emergency shelter during a weather crisis, putting multiple people at risk of serious injury or death. The fraud charge related to misrepresenting the community center's capabilities to residents and collecting HOA fees under false pretenses. My phone started ringing immediately. Neighbors wanted to know if I knew what was happening. Reporters wanted comments, and my family was concerned about whether I was involved. I ignored most of the calls and texts, but I did call Marcus. "Did you see the news?" I asked. "I did." "Xavier, you should know that you'll probably be called as a witness if this goes to trial." I figured. I'm okay with that. Also, the HOA's case against you is effectively dead. With Helen facing criminal charges, they're not going to have the credibility or resources to pursue fines against you. He was right. 2 days later, I received a letter from a law firm representing the Pine Ridge HOA. It stated that, pending further review, all fines and penalties against my property were being suspended. The letter carefully avoided admitting any wrongdoing, but made it clear they weren't going to pursue the issue further. The HOA also announced that Helen Norton and the other charged board member had resigned their positions, effective immediately. An emergency election would be held to replace them. Over the next few months, the criminal case moved forward. The local media covered it extensively, particularly when details emerged about how close Mrs. Henderson had come to dying from hypothermia. There was public outrage that an HOA president could be so reckless with residents' safety. Helen's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA's office was firm. The case went to trial in September. I testified for a full day, walking the jury through my documentation and explaining the timeline. The prosecutor did an excellent job presenting the evidence, showing how Helen had repeatedly claimed the emergency shelter was functional despite knowing it wasn't. The Hendersons testified, with Mrs. Henderson describing in emotional detail how she'd nearly frozen to death after being directed to the non-functional shelter. The Martins testified about rushing their newborn baby through the cold to a building that wasn't heated. The defense tried to argue that Helen had simply made a mistake, that she'd believed the backup heat would work despite the failed inspection. But the prosecutor produced emails showing Helen had been directly informed about the inspection issues and had chosen to ignore them rather than pay for the necessary corrections. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Helen was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, with credit for time served, and 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and the affected residents. The other board member received probation and community service. The case attracted attention beyond Douglas County. Several news outlets ran stories about HOA overreach and the dangers of unqualified people wielding authority over communities. I was interviewed by a few reporters, though I tried to keep a low profile. In October, the Pine Ridge HOA held their emergency election. The new board included Tom from across the street, Mrs. Henderson, and 3 other residents who'd been critical of the previous leadership. One of their first acts was to formally apologize to me and rescind all fines related to my propane system. They also commissioned a full review of the community center's safety systems. The propane backup heat was properly repaired and permitted, at significant expense to the HOA. The new board voted to update the covenant language to explicitly allow properly permitted backup power and heating systems for residential properties. By November, life had mostly returned to normal. The neighborhood had moved on from the scandal, though Helen Norton's name was still occasionally mentioned as a cautionary tale. Her house went up for sale in December, and I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband were moving to Arizona. I kept my propane tanks, properly maintaining them as I always had. When another winter storm hit in January, knocking out power for 2 days, my system performed flawlessly. I helped a few neighbors again, though this time without the drama. The community center also served as an emergency shelter, with its now functional backup heat keeping dozens of residents warm. The new HOA board did everything right, coordinating with the county's emergency management office and ensuring everyone knew the shelter was available and operational. In February, almost exactly a year after the first ice storm, I received a handwritten note from Mrs. Henderson. She thanked me again for potentially saving her life and for having the courage to stand up to Helen Norton's corruption. She wrote that the neighborhood was better off because I'd refused to be bullied. I kept that note on my refrigerator for months. It reminded me why I'd fought so hard, even when it seemed easier to just pay the fines and move on. The legal fees from my HOA dispute ended up being about $8,000, which Marcus helped me recover from the HOA's insurance as part of the settlement. The hours of stress and frustration were harder to quantify, but looking back, I wouldn't have done things differently. Tom and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. We started a tradition of having a neighborhood barbecue every summer, bringing together the people who'd weathered the storms together, both literal and figurative. The new HOA board operated transparently and reasonably. They focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement of ambiguous rules. Property values in Pine Ridge actually increased after the scandal, as potential buyers saw the community as one that had cleaned house and learned from its mistakes. In March of the following year, I was asked to serve on the HOA board myself. I declined, explaining that I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime, but I appreciated the gesture. Instead, I agreed to serve on the safety committee, helping to ensure that all community facilities and systems were properly maintained and permitted. My relationship with my neighbors deepened in ways I hadn't expected. The crisis had created bonds that lasted long after the immediate danger had passed. We looked out for each other, not because an HOA board told us to, but because we genuinely cared. I thought about Helen Norton sometimes, wondering what drove her to make the choices she did. Was it ego? Incompetence? A desire to avoid admitting mistakes? Probably a combination of all three. She'd had an opportunity to serve her community, but had instead put people in danger to protect her own reputation. The county used the Pine Ridge case as a catalyst for reviewing HOA regulations across Douglas County. They implemented new oversight requirements for common facilities like community centers, ensuring that safety systems were actually functional and not just claimed to be. Several other HOAs were found to have similar issues with unpermitted work and non-functional backup systems. My propane tanks sat on their concrete pad, quietly doing their job. They represented more than just backup heat to me now. They symbolized the importance of preparation, the value of helping neighbors, and the necessity of standing up against unreasonable authority. The whole experience taught me important lessons about community, responsibility, and the dangers of unchecked power. HOAs serve a legitimate purpose, but they require oversight and accountability like any organization with authority over people's lives and property. I also learned that sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing. It would have been easier to just remove my propane tanks and avoid the conflict. But by fighting back, I'd helped expose a serious safety issue and potentially prevented future harm. Every winter, when the first snow started falling on the Colorado foothills, I'd walk outside and check my propane tanks. The gauge would show they were full and ready. The connections would be tight and leak-free. Everything would be in order, properly maintained and permitted, exactly as it should be. And I'd feel grateful, not just for the warmth and security the system provided, but for the reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, is always worth it in the end. The community center across the neighborhood stood as its own reminder. Its propane tanks, now properly installed and inspected, served their intended purpose. The building was ready to be an actual emergency shelter, not just claimed to be one. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on my back deck and watch the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of orange and purple. My house was warm, my neighbors were safe, and my community was better for having gone through the trial by fire. The propane tanks that had started all this trouble had become something else entirely. They were a symbol of resilience, of community, and of the simple truth that doing the right thing, while sometimes costly and difficult, creates ripples that extend far beyond the original act. I never expected that helping my neighbors during a winter storm would lead to criminal investigations, trials, and a complete reorganization of my HOA. But life is full of unexpected turns. The important thing is how we navigate them. Tom and I sat on my deck one evening in early spring, beers in hand, watching his kids play in the street as the days grew longer. "You ever regret buying in Pine Ridge?" he asked. I thought about it for a moment. No, not even a little bit. Even after everything with Helen and the HOA. Especially after that. This neighborhood is stronger now. We learned what matters and what doesn't. Tom nodded, taking a sip of his beer. My wife still talks about that week during the ice storm, how scary it was, but also how amazing it was to see neighbors taking care of each other. She says it reminded her why we wanted to live in a real community in the first place. That's exactly it. Community isn't about following rules for the sake of rules. It's about people looking out for each other when it matters. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the mountains catch the last light of the day. The story of my battle with the Pine Ridge HOA eventually became something of a local legend. New residents would hear about it and ask questions. I'd tell them the basics, though I always emphasized the lessons rather than the drama. I'd explain the importance of proper permits and safety systems. I'd talk about the dangers of assuming that institutional claims were accurate without verification. And I'd remind them that their HOA board members were just neighbors with a bit of authority, not infallible experts who should be blindly trusted. The community's attitude toward the HOA changed fundamentally. Residents now attended meetings regularly, asked questions, and demanded transparency. The board operated knowing that their decisions would be scrutinized and challenged if they overstepped. It was a healthier dynamic, even if it made the board's job harder. Good governance is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to involve accountability and oversight. The Pine Ridge community had learned that lesson the difficult way. My propane system continued to serve me well. Every time I looked at those tanks, I thought about the journey they'd taken me on. From simple backup heat to evidence in a criminal trial to a symbol of community resilience. In the end, the HOA had tried to fine me for stockpiling propane tanks. I'd removed their leverage by standing firm on principle and facts. And when I brought attention to their unpermitted system, their backup heat vanished, along with Helen Norton's freedom and the old board's authority. It was a harsh outcome, but a necessary one. People had nearly died because of incompetence and ego. The community deserved better, and now they had it. Years from now, I imagined, someone would move into Helen Norton's old house. They'd hear the story about the HOA president who went to jail for lying about the emergency shelter. And they'd learn the name of the neighbor with the propane tanks who'd helped expose the truth. I hoped they'd understand that the story wasn't really about propane tanks or HOA rules. It was about the responsibility we all have to stand up when we see something wrong, even when it's difficult and costly. As I sat there on my deck that spring evening, watching the day fade into dusk, I felt satisfied. Not smug or victorious, but quietly satisfied that I'd done the right thing. My neighborhood was safer. My neighbors were more engaged, and the systems meant to protect people actually worked now. The propane tanks sat behind their privacy fence, exactly where they'd always been, properly maintained and ready for the next emergency. They weren't going anywhere, and neither was I. This was my home, my community, and my responsibility to help protect it. The HOA had tried to fine me into submission, but instead, they'd learned an important lesson about accountability and the dangers of abusing authority. It was a lesson that resonated far beyond Pine Ridge, Colorado, to HOA communities across the country dealing with similar issues of overreach and corruption. And it all started because I wanted to keep my family and neighbors warm during winter storms. Sometimes the simplest, most decent motivations lead to the most significant outcomes. That was the real story of my propane tanks and the HOA that tried to take them away.